Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. For once, I am doing this intro during the day. I can be as boisterous as I want, as opposed to when I usually record these intros about midnight, and I'm trying not to wake up Naomi or the pets. And you know what? I'm going to be very boisterous because I'm very excited about today's guest. This is Arnold Dreyblatt. And if you don't know who Arnold is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from New York City, composer and artist Arnold Dreyblatt is part of the second generation of New York minimal composers, having studied with Pauline Oliveros, Lamont Young, and Alvin Lucier. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I've only ever seen it written. His first album, Nodal Excitation, was released in 1982, and since then, he's recorded almost a dozen more, including 1995's Animal Magnetism, which was released on Sodic. Based in Berlin since 1984, Arnold was professor of media art at the Muthesius Academy of Art and Design in Kiel, Germany, for almost a decade and a half, and is currently deputy director of the visual arts section at the German Academy of Art. His most recent album, Resolve, was released last August on Drag City, and folks, it is fantastic. I've been a fan of Arnold's compositions since, I'm going to say, college. That's about the time I started listening to modern composition and going through the Sodic back catalog. And if Arnold's not one of the best in the game, I will eat my hat. Is my hat made of edible food like potato chips, making that not a great threat? What is it when you say, if blank isn't blank, I'll eat my hat? It's not a threat. What is that? A promise? Anyway, this was great. It was really great. I obviously Zoomed with Arnold from Germany, so there was a big old time zone difference. And Arnold had just gotten back from a big trip, but he was very gracious in answering my questions, talking with me. And we got into a lot of stuff about his childhood in New York and his parents, and it was really cool. As well as a lot about the music scene at the time, and about moving to Germany, because I did start off, I think, it's been a while since I've heard this, but I did start off talking about how my wife and I are looking to flee the United States at some point. Well, look, things are not flee the United States bad at the moment, but in my lifetime, could it be? Maybe. All signs point to probably. So we talked about that, and yeah, great talk. I hope you enjoy it. And folks, if you do enjoy it, why not check out other episodes of Beginnings? I've been doing this show. By next week, it'll be 14 years. I've been doing this show for 1 week shy of 14 years. First episode debuted Jan 26, 2010. And that means I have done hundreds of interviews with musicians, with actors, with comedians, with writers, with authors. And look, I'm not going to just drop you in the deep end. That's a lot of episodes, 600 some odd episodes, right? Plus, I think like a ton of bonus ones. So what I like to do here in the beginning of the show, in the intro, is a little recommended if you like. If you like my talk with Arnold, maybe you'll like my talk with other composers that I've had on the show. For example, David Harrington from Kronos Quartet, Bobby Previtt, Jeff Parker, Terry Riley, Bill Orchid, Zena Parkins, Rob Mazurek. Check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, why not subscribe to the show? Why not leave a review? Why not? In fact, if you listen to this on Spotify, which, let's be honest, I was going to say is a worsening platform to listen to music on. At the very least, I can say it's extremely unfair unless you are Ariana Grande or someone like that. But anyway, if you use it, I suppose you can click 5 stars if you want. Also, I'm on social media. I mean, what is it worth these days? But if you want to see pictures of my wife or my cats, or sometimes a comedy video on Instagram, I'm at Andy Beckerman. Coming up next week, Jonathan Lethem. One of my favorite authors, Jonathan Lethem. Also, I just recorded an episode with Jewel Taylor, the co-writer and director of They Clone Tyrone, one of the best films of last year. So stay tuned for those episodes. But for now, let's talk to Arnold. I'm very curious. You live in Berlin. Is that a good place to escape to? Things in America are looking positively dystopian at this point. And
yes, I'm American, so I read the news from both sides. And I certainly understand that it's pretty scary what's going to happen next year. So I mean, but yeah, I think that on one hand, well, I've been here a really long time in Berlin. I've been here since the 80s, early 80s. But in the last years, there's been a flood of young people coming from the States, from Southern Europe, from Israel, from different places. I mean, just, it's unfortunately not as cheap as it used to be. But, if you're coming from New York, it's not too expensive. I don't know. LA is a little bit cheaper, though I hear it's getting also more expensive. But there's a lot of young people. I mean, there are parts of the city, you go into a cafe, they don't even speak German. Yeah. So it's a kind of and there's a lot of initiatives also in music. There's a kind of experimental music club that's run by Americans. Americans work there. There's actually a few of them. There's actually an ensemble here that plays in just intonation called the Harmonic. Okay, I forget the name of the harmonic ensemble or harmonic orchestra, and it's all Americans. And it's crazy, yeah, in a way. It wasn't like that when I came. I mean, there were some Americans, of course, but it was also when I came, the wall was up. The Berlin Wall was up. But
that's right.
Yeah. How old are you?
I am 44.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, but anyway, I'm 70, so I've seen a lot.
Yeah. Was it a big emotional decision to move to be an expatriate?
Well, it wasn't a decision which was instant. So basically, I had a first actually Phil Niblock, my old friend. He helped me set up my first tour, and I got some help from a grant to do that in 1983. And I sort of bumped around Europe, and then also hit Berlin. I was supposed to stay for a month, and I stayed for like almost 6 months, and kept meeting people. It was not a great time in New York then, or at least that's my feeling. It was the crack period, AIDS, and it was just it was a kind of a depressing time. Like this for me, the 60s ended in like 78. And then by the early 80s, New York was really poor. I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but there's like, it's the Ford to New York drop dead period.
Yeah.
You know what that means. Okay. So, and also, I'm born in New York, so I needed to go somewhere too. Everybody was coming to New York from Ohio or somewhere, and, you kind of got to leave your hometown at some point. Of course, so I bumped around. I came back. I applied for a grant, which I got to come to Berlin for a year. But I kind of felt like it was a little bit more open-ended. And I didn't have I had a little storefront in Brooklyn, but I didn't have a lot to go back to. Like I was able to survive pretty quickly in Berlin. Berlin was very cheap back then. I was able to survive without having a day job. And I'd come back to New York, and everybody'd say, like, don't even think about coming back here. And that was a period. And then, things happen. And I think when I was in Europe for 7 years, because I was in Berlin, then I was a lot in Budapest in the 80s and in East Bloc. And then I moved to Holland, or actually I moved to Belgium, and I was unhappy there. And I came back to Berlin just before the wall came down. I came back, realizing that actually was the best compromise. So it wasn't like I decided one day to be an expatriate. It was more like it sort of crept up on me. And, it got harder to go back. I lost my place. The thought of starting up all over again in New York was daunting. There were things happening with me here. And, I think there was a time when I was in Belgium, there was kind of a moment where I thought, from practical aspects, it seemed like I should go back already. But there was something in me that didn't feel like it was over yet. And so I came back to Berlin, started up again, and a lot of things happened then. to me. So positive things. So, and the city changed and all of this. So, and eventually then I had a family. I taught in an art school for 13 years. So a lot of things happened. But, and now actually more of my adult life is here than in the States. So, but I always say, like, here I'm very American. And when I go back to the States, I kind of miss Berlin, or, I'm very excited usually to hit New York. And the first week I'm like in heaven, because, I understand, like, I hear those, that New York accent, and I kind of slide into it. And, but at some point it's like, these people are crazy. I got to get out of here. So, but, I mean, I love to be in the States, but yeah, I mean, my life has been more here. I would love to spend a bit more time in the States than I have in the past. Okay, who knows what's going to happen? But just personally, I would like to spend some longer periods. I had a child, I was teaching, I couldn't really do that, but now I could. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just yeah. How's LA?
Terrible. I mean, so my wife's from New York. I lived in New York for over a decade before we moved here, and we moved here for work. And I wonder if we had moved to a city that was more similar to New York, say Berlin,
Right.
would we have been? It's fine. It's just that we moved here for work. This is where all the work is.
Okay. And where were you born?
Reading, Pennsylvania, which is like 3 hours from New York.
Right.
My parents are from New York. I have like all these connections to New York and live there, but like.
Right. And how did they go? Why did they go to Reading, Pennsylvania?
To take care of my grandmother. And they just had a family, and then they ended up staying. It's one of those things where like you just kind of like.
So part of your family is from Reading, Pennsylvania,
yeah,
and part from New York.
Yeah, and it's just like I asked that first question about like the emotional, like did the emotional kind of impact of moving, especially moving across the Atlantic Ocean,
right?
Because just moving to Los Angeles has not felt great. And I was thinking about how do I think a lot about how do your emotional states impact the things you make. And if you live in a city where things feel right, I bet there's a kind of synergy that happens then between your inner state and the music, in your case, that emerges out of you. But I don't know. That's just a bland.
Yeah, thesis. I mean, the music, it's actually impacted. I mean, if you really want to know the truth, is because I'm also a visual artist and I do a lot of other things. So it actually has a lot more influence on my other work as an artist. I think my music is very much coming out of New York still. I mean, if anything, I did a lot of travel in Eastern Europe. I was very interested. I mean, even in the States or in New York, I was interested in kind of in folk music and world music before there was a name for it. And when I came here, that continued. But, it's a strange thing because I still feel somehow, and I think people see it that way, that the music is related to, because, it comes out of a certain period of minimalism in New York and this lineage. And it relates to that. I mean, of course, it's developed over, I have my own thing. And yes, it has, I've had some freedom here that I may not have had in New York. I don't know. I mean, at the moment I came, I felt very free. I wasn't really sure. I mean, it's a funny thing. It was an issue about maybe, I was coming out of one hand, I was a student of Lamont. I was friends with Phil Niblock. It was like a very much a drone world. But from the very beginning, I seemed to be attracted by having rhythm in my music. So, and I felt a little embarrassed about that in New York. But when I came over here, I just, let it happen. So, for instance, the first record, Nodal Excitation, doesn't have drums on it or percussion. And I kind of let that happen when I wanted to include it, but I felt uncomfortable in New York. It's hard to reconstruct all that, what feelings I had then, we're talking about 40 years ago. But when I came here, I felt a certain freedom. On one hand, I had no history. That's something when you go to a new place anyway. Yeah. And in leaving the country and, this is far away. On the other hand, there was a great interest in and music coming out of New York and culture coming out of New York. And there's this certain way in which, especially in the post-war era, that the Germans were like addicted to culture. They're like, especially at that time. So partially because they lost kind of a large part of their culture, by killing all the Jews. So they and there was this kind of like unbelievable addiction. So which, and okay, of course, there's always been a lot going on in New York and I don't know, some the West Coast. And okay, there's more now in between because of the internet and knowledge. But at that time, there was almost, it was really hard in between the coasts. There was no information. Like once you left, you were, where would you get, there's not, yeah, well, you know this. So that was actually, so coming here was a bit welcoming, they were very welcoming. I have to admit that. And there was a lot of interest. There was a lot of state money for the arts. I remember one time reading, I'm not sure exactly when this period was, but that the budget for the State Opera of Frankfurt, and of course, all these things they're not private, they're all state. The budget for the State Opera in Frankfurt is larger than the National Endowment for the Arts or something, this kind of thing. So, yeah. So, and I mean, I think, I come out of, I was very young, but I come out very much out of this kind of this New York, or at least, my peers were coming out of the 60s in New York, and this, it's a long history, even going back to the 50s, not only in music, but also in all the arts, and this kind of downtown energy, which also, it's a little bit different in the visual arts, but also existed with very little money. So that things changed later, but I have a very strong memory of that. But when I came here, the situation in New York was getting harder, and it's funny because, of course, I realize when I talk about this to other young people, it was like, we're talking about the early 80s, also seems like 100 years ago. So how could it have been changed so much from the 70s? But I think for me, yeah, it was a bit liberating. There was a lot of interest. There were a lot of possibilities. And not only that, yeah, because at that time, you basically couldn't leave New York. You could go to the West Coast, but it costs a lot of money to travel. There was no internet. It was just not like now there's all, there's a network, there's all those college towns. They existed then, but information was not traveling as fast. And so I had the feeling, I think I played in New Music America in Washington. I was in Minneapolis and a few things, but, it was hard. And then I came to Europe, and it was like, every city in Germany and Holland, and I started bopping around, and there was every little place had their classical culture, their opera house, their state theater, and then they had some little places for music. So you could just keep traveling, and and then it would be like, in Maryland, there would be a whole nother, cultural thing like New York. Maybe not as much, of course, but, so I realized that, and that just seemed very liberating to me. And, you just hop on a train, you're in Italy. I was very interested then in the arts, especially the music scenes in the East Bloc. I spent a lot of time in Budapest in Hungary. And there was an interest in minimalism. And it was a whole other world, but I have to say I had a lot of friends that were coming over and, performing from New York. But then comes the question, why did I stay and nobody else? Yeah. So there were a few others in different periods. Gordon Monahan was here for a long time. I don't know if you know him. He's a Canadian composer, musician, very interesting. And David Moss. Maybe you heard the name. There's a few people that got stuck, but generally a lot of people came over and say, yeah, this is great, and went back. So there's a question, why did I stay? And I can't really answer that,
Did you, okay. Do you think you had strong family ties or strong, because I'm trying to think of like, I guess one of the reasons we are okay in Los Angeles, even though we're not huge fans of the city itself, is, besides the fact that this is where the work is that we love our families, but we are happy having an entire country in between us and them.
Yeah. Well, I understand that. I think that, okay, when I left at that time, because I come from a huge kind of extended family, and there were also a lot of complications. And I think that it was very hard especially for my parents, I remember, because I'm an only child. But it was very hard for many, many years, almost until the 90s for them. When, then I got married and I started to visit more, get connected. But I definitely understand that even, in my point of view at that time, probably California was too close, like another country, so I think maybe there was a bit of that I needed to just get away from them. So even though as I got older, of course, I started to somehow develop a different relationship, and also I became more family oriented. But, and sometimes I'm sorry that because a lot of people died, whole generations died. I kept up with a lot of people, but, sometimes I wish I was there for some of that. But so it's a little bit different. I mean, okay, there's a little bit of a time zone thing with California, but okay, 3 hours, you can kind of figure that out. And you can fly back and forth if you have to. I actually have an uncle who even had a marriage between LA and Washington. So, okay, they're together now, but and he's 99. So,
wow.
but yeah, I understand that. That's absolutely true. There's a bit of that in it also, because I was 30 when I left, or not left. I didn't really leave. I came for a year to Berlin, or I traveled, and I came for a year, then I extended it for 2 years, then to 3. And then I was starting to realize, okay, maybe I'm not going to go back so fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
And things changed in New York also.
Well, yeah. I mean, things got worse in New York, and then the Giuliani era hit, and then things it got better. Like, you could walk around Times Square and be okay, but I don't, the New York that I mythologized was the New York of the late 70s and early 80s that you were in.
Yeah.
And then when I got there, it was nothing like that. It was safer, but it was also, I think, kind of not as artistically robust.
What year was that?
2008, by the time I got there. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't, it's also that even though it changed a lot, and every year I would see it change again more and more. I used to say that sometimes I felt like, I feel like Rip Van Winkle, like waking up after, because like my neighborhood in Brooklyn, which was actually really kind of dangerous and rough, is now like totally gentrified with high rises and co-ops and stuff. So condos. So, yeah, I understand that. But yeah, what I want to say is that I still have some old friends and contacts from that time. So a few, and that kind of keeps it, or gives it a different, at least I don't even know how to express this, but, I can make believe a little bit I'm back home, even though I'm not really sure if it's really home. No, but I understand it totally changed, I mean, even the early 80s, I don't think, okay, it depends, there's different scenes. There's, people relate to a particular, like for your music, like particular music that was happening. Of course, that continued all the way through. But for me, okay, the 60s, okay, I was very young in the 60s, but, I used to go cut high school, go downtown to the East Village. I had a friend, we used to go to the Fillmore East, stay up all night to the late show and, tell our parents we were sleeping at the other one's house and stuff like this already in high school. So, I knew something was happening really big. And then, the early 70s, I mean, again, I was young, but I somehow connected to it. Yeah. What was happening. And I've done a lot of also thinking about that period. Yeah. Okay, but that's another story. So Is this what we're supposed to be talking about? Or you want?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very interested.
Okay.
Did you have a particular ambition at that time?
When I was young.
Yeah. And so you're a teenager in the 60s, right?
Right. I'm a teenager in the 60s. Okay. The 60s was, especially in New York, there was a lot going on. And in the culture, drugs, the whole hippie thing, and the political action, there was a lot happening. And in my case, wait, what was the question?
Did you have a particular ambition when you were a teenager?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, my mother was a painter, and she had some success for a while, but some galleries at some point. My father was not an artist, but a super classical music fanatic. So, I was brought to concerts and museums when I was young. So, and I had some other members of the family that were artistically oriented, So, an aunt who I liked very much, who played viola da gamba, another aunt who was a professor of dance and had danced with Maurice Cunningham and Martha Graham, and then taught for me. I mean, so there were people like this. Not that everybody was like this, but there were a few, and role models. I went to a summer camp that was kind of a very artsy, and I had a lot of freedom there. I got into photography then. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think if there's anything that I didn't really have a commercial interest, like this whole world that we live in now, where everything you have to be professional, you have to, and at least my memory of this period was, and it was probably my take on it. There are obviously people who came out of that and just kind of made their whole careers, but I was very much interested in learning about stuff, and it varied. So I didn't even come into, I was not, I didn't do well with the music lessons when I was a kid, but I really liked music. I mean, of course, it was a big part of the 60s, the rock bands, and I started getting interested in more experimental stuff and jazz. And I had a friend when I was an undergraduate who was very interested in electronic music, and he went off to do stuff with, I don't know, it's a person you probably don't know, Joel Chatterby, who died recently, who was a early electronic music composer. And then I went to graduate school in Buffalo, where I studied with two video artists, Woody and Stana Visulka, and who founded The Kitchen. Their work was kind of video art that was kind of, they call it electronic image. They worked a lot with analog audio, producing images and back and forth. And when I came to Buffalo, Buffalo had a very important music department. So Morton Feldman was there. I walked into his office there, and there was actually June in Buffalo was starting just as I arrived. And I was kind of an outsider because I was coming from a department of media art. It was called Media Studies. And but he knew them, and Buffalo was a very interesting period. It was very interesting there, and there were a lot of interesting people around. And then he told me that Pauline Oliveros was coming, and actually this Joel Chatterby was coming to teach, and he knew actually there was a kind of family connection to Feldman. So he said, "Oh yeah, you can come in, do it, whatever, join in." And he was very nice to me, and so that was kind of my beginning into music. Yeah, even though I was, in this other department, but I did do some experiments also then with sine waves and things like that. Pauline Oliveros was kind of my first music teacher. And I always tell the story that I was in this composition class for a month with all these composition students, very serious. And she spent a day with each student, and you could do whatever you want. That was really fantastic. And and then I came down to New York. I actually found I was doing stuff with sine waves. I was, kind of interested in music, but I wasn't sure. I mean, I was starting to do stuff with electronics. This Joel Chatterby was very good at explaining the basic fundamentals of audio, of sound. And then I found actually a book, Selected Writings in Hollis Frampton's bookcase. Hollis Frampton was an experimental filmmaker. And it was all, it was about his music. It fascinated me. He gave me the book, and then I finished. Oh yeah, then John Cage came, and then I went back to New York, and I went to a Lamont Young concert and walked up to him, and he was kind of always on the lookout for slaves, and he knew, some of the people I was involved with, and yeah, then things started up.
Okay, so is this?
Wait, just before this is like things happened to me. Yeah, it was more like I would get interested in something and I would want to be closer to those people. That was it. I didn't have an idea about at least in the very beginning, like I'm going to make a career at this. It was more like I want to get closer to it. And gradually later, then I thought I want to do something myself. Yeah.
That's what I think is interesting, because it's almost like the way you described moving to Berlin, where it was this kind of gradual process as opposed to all right, I have this ambition. I have this idea in my head. I'm going to linearly follow this out with just a clear-eyed, like straight line. Right.
Right.
And I'm wondering if when you were younger, when you were a kid, were there things that you were there other things you were interested in? Were there other paths you could have taken? Or was it always, I have this affinity for art, let's say, because you said you started in this more video program, right? This experimental video program. Was it more of an affinity and then you kind of just like moved in that direction because you kept moving closer to the stuff you liked, or were there other things that that caught your fancy when you were younger?
Interesting. Well, I know that, I told you already, my father was also kind of an amateur photographer. So we had a dark room in the basement. So, and he had a lot of cameras, he was filming everything. So I was familiar with all that. That's one thing. Then, going to concerts, but not really being a musician. I think that when I was young, I was interested in literature. So I was kind of like the beats and poetry. And I used to go to poetry readings when I was already still in high school downtown. And I tried to start it was a bit naive. I was like 17. I wanted to start a magazine and talk to some other people who would write for it. So there was that, and I started writing, and I don't know how old I was. I must have been like 17. I already read in the Village in an open night, and at the same time, this is a little embarrassing. I became a Grateful Dead fan when I was like 17, so which lasted a few years, and I think by the time I was 19, it was over. But and I went on to other music, and. So I was into music, music was such a part of the culture then, look, the Beatles played in Shea Stadium, which is in Queens, where I grew up. So I saw that, well, I don't know what I saw. I heard a lot of people screaming. I was, in 1963, I was 10 years old when they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, but I saw all of that. I saw the bands one after the other. There were some girls on the block that tried to be groupies. Bob Dylan played at the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. I think it was still acoustic, even like maybe it was before he went electric. Then the summer camp I went to used to go to it was kind of a leftist camp. We used to go to the Newport Folk Festival every year in a cattle truck. So I saw, I didn't see Dylan go electric, but I remember I saw Arlo Guthrie sing Alice's Restaurant the first time in public. And we went every, couple of years, and it became the Jazz Festival. So all that had a huge impact. But yeah, it's interesting, like, was there a real agenda? Like, I want to do this. Yeah, I think there was a period, I think I got very interested in music when I was in Buffalo. Because actually, in fact, I was doing these videotapes, some of which had soundtracks. And then I really abandoned video, and then I worked in Anthology Film Archives in New York in the video program. But then I was studying with Lamont. I was also cleaning house for Nam June Paik and Shueiko Kubota. But I was really but I moved into music then. Then I really wanted to do music, So I can't say exactly. Well, obviously, I went to study with Lamont. I wanted to know more, and then somehow all of that resulted in, because I could have done other. I mean, it was clear it was going to be music related to tuning, and somehow from this, interest in world music and minimalism, etc. But I there is an aspect of rock and roll in my music.
Yeah.
And I think it probably comes from, and that's maybe more what I was saying when I came to Europe. I kind of let it out. I didn't censor it anymore, because I think there was some feeling like, are you going to pop or not to pop? I was in New York at that time. It was very concentrated, very, I don't know, singular. So people were very close together, and it was like, are you in this camp or that camp? And when I came here, it didn't really matter anymore. But so I think all those things had something to do with who I am. It's interesting because my visual art work is very much to do with text. And so that probably might come from, those other early interests. Yeah. So, yeah, it's really hard to say what, yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy. Yeah.
There's some people I talk to where it feels more like there's a critical mass as opposed to a pathway, right? You were surrounded, I was reading about, your grandfather was a clarinetist in vaudeville, right? Your mother's a painter. Your father, you said, is a photographer, is interested also in classical music. It just feels like you're surrounded in a certain sense. Yeah. That doesn't necessitate a direction for you.
No, absolutely not. I know that.
Yeah. But it gives you a kind of I don't know if we want to talk about this in terms of like physics, like there's a field around you, right? In terms of creating I guess field. I'll just stick with that, right? There's a area around you as opposed to a pathway, and so you are just in this kind of soaking it all up, and then letting that kind of propel you forward. I know I've mixed a lot of metaphors there, but does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that I think you're right. I mean, it's just so hard to, because I could have just said, no, I'm not into that. It's like, there are kids from, it's interesting because I watched my own son who for a long time, he was like, he was dragged to exhibitions since he was a kid. And it's like the last thing I want to have anything to do with the arts, because my wife is an art historian. So, but then now that he's studying, he starts to realize that actually that's a part of him too. So he's actually studying design and architecture. I mean, so yeah, it's, some kids reject it all. And from whatever. And what I also want to say, it wasn't easy. So yes, I kind of let myself be blown by the wind and follow what I was interested in. I was absolutely not practical and not, like there are people that think, okay, I'm really interested in this, I got to figure out a way to make money. I got to, I mean, of course, the times then were very nebulous. So there was just a lot of weird, crazy people going around with all their things. So I really followed that. And I was maybe naive what it would mean. So I didn't, maybe there might have been some things I could have done that I think in retrospect that would have made the path easier. So I lived a long time without very little money. I didn't even know how to get money. I've never been a big, a business person in this whole thing. And I think, and I saw people fall to the wayside around me also who just, various things. They got married, they moved away, they just realized this is bullshit, this is too hard, or no, or people feel like they're not recognized enough and get bitter. There's all kinds of things that happen along the way. People stop. This is another theme, but I've been, at one point I was interested in like artists, composers, people that had, were really in the scene that just like left it and didn't want anything to do with it anymore. So some of those people have been rediscovered, but not all of them. So yeah, I mean, so what is it that made me keep going, even though the conditions were not easy for me either? I mean, I kept going. There were people that helped me, of course, also, different. And just talking about music, certain composers helped along the way, but there were also some very difficult times. So because of not having a kind of a floor under you, yeah. So it just not to romanticize the whole thing. So I don't know. I mean, I can't really say if I would know what I know now. But okay, actually, it worked out, but it took a long time. So, and I was really, even though I followed my interest, but I just didn't know where it was going to go or from. Yeah.
When you were younger, you said your mom was a gallery artist for a time. Did you see how she dealt with the business end of making art in a capitalist society, or was that hidden from you?
Actually, maybe I should correct that. So she painted her whole life. But she also had some problems. She was physically handicapped. She had some galleries that were interested in her. I mean, she went through 2 galleries, but already by the time I was kind of coming into like maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 years old, one closed, the second one at some point closed. She kept painting, but I think in that time also was very hard for her as a woman. She didn't get enough really support. And I made a little Wikipedia page about her work, and I've done some things, but it's not, I don't think that she was an example in that. I don't think I had, okay, that's maybe also a point. I didn't have any example. I mean, even though there were business people in the family, my father was also not very good at that. And even though he wasn't an artist, but so I didn't have much examples of that in my, through my parents. I could have looked further, but I didn't.
What did your dad do for a living when you were younger?
He was a watchmaker.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he's actually not, it doesn't mean it's what they used to call someone who worked with watches or a jeweler. I mean, he worked in the watch industry and he knew how to take apart watches. But then at some point when digital watches came, which is earlier than people think, it was like Timex already came in I guess that must have been late 70s, or Japanese watches, then he started to have problems. Yeah, there just wasn't enough work for him.
Did you learn to take things apart when you were younger?
Interesting, because I grew up with my grandfather, who was a carpenter type. But no, I was never, I did, there was a period where I did work on my instruments and learn a little bit, but I wasn't that type of kid that took apart electronics or, could fix the refrigerator or something. I was a space cadet.
Interesting. Okay, because it seemed like I don't want to say, it wasn't like you were directionless. It didn't seem like you were that, but that you had interests and things like that. But that it wasn't there wasn't a thing you wanted from life.
Well, no, yes, and that's not true, because I did somehow, in the way that you're young and you see these examples of older composers and artists and people who are respected for what they do. I wasn't necessarily thinking of it in a financial way at all, but I respected people. I had my peers. There was, all through my life, there's been a lot of people that I felt influenced by or appreciated, and I wanted to be appreciated also in some way. Yeah, so it sounds quite corny, but I guess it's a normal human thing, so I don't know. I mean, I went to a Phil Glass concert, or even at some point I saw Einstein on the Beach and stuff. I started doing theater productions in Berlin at some point. So I moved through different things. And of course, because there are some, eccentric artists who don't care anything, whether they're appreciated or not, they're working like a mole. And, maybe they're discovered late in life, or they work for years. That's hard. There's less of those people now than there used to be. But I was not like that. I mean, I wanted to be appreciated. for what I do. So that shouldn't be misunderstood. I mean, I think, yeah, in some ways, some of these people were models for me of like a life in the arts. It's what I used to tell my students. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that today, what that means, a life in the arts. So because it's like a career thing, but I never thought of it as a career, but I did think of it as a life in the arts. And in a way, by my moving, I think at some point, in some naive way, I wanted to be a composer with his band early on, which is why I did that. And I had the model of like Lamont Young and then the other minimalists with their ensembles, which was very new in in that generation. I mean, it existed in jazz and in rock music, but it didn't exist in classical music in that sense. Maybe Bach with his church ensemble, but not in Juilliard or in Princeton. So, I wanted that. That was a model for me.
Yes, I see. Okay, I'm starting to get a better picture now. I wonder if you had this at all, or if you felt this, but I create this hierarchy of art, and the more non-commercial you are, I place someone higher up on this thing, because the battles that I have are between, someone's paying me to write a script, say, and there's a large part of that where I just have to do what this person wants me to do.
Right.
And there's my own beliefs, and there's the things that I want to write into, say, a script, and my own, say, like political beliefs that I want the characters to have or something like that. But
is that what you do?
Yeah.
You write, you're a screenwriter?
Yeah, and a TV writer. Yeah.
Writer.
I just have to, there's just the commercial aspects overpower everything else.
Right.
I wondered, did you gravitate towards art where you didn't have to make compromises, where it could be a more perfect version of whatever was coming out of you? Does that make sense at all?
Okay, this is a whole, I understand where you're getting at. Okay, one thing is like writing just to kind of think about the differences. So there are, there's this model of, there's like, you have your clients or something, people ask you to decide. I mean, it exists in the arts also. You get a commission to write a piece, you hang around for people, this has always existed, the Medicis or something, or, patrons, and there's grants. I mean, the whole system is also, you're somehow doing, if you're a member of a gallery, they have expectations, and that could go badly. They could want you to change your style, or, make it always the same, or, make it identifiable. And, there's commercial pressures in the arts also, and maybe even more so now as it's become more commercial. But what you're talking about is a very clearly defined role. I mean, a role model. I mean, so where there's, that you're hired to do something, and okay, this is also an old issue, like an architect, like, I don't know, Mies van der Rohe, or architects who wanted, or Frank Lloyd Wright, that even the furniture has to be what they want, even if the people don't like it who buy it. I mean, there's compromises. There's also compromise in the arts. So I learned that, there's some periods where there's pressures. I mean, artists do, deal with that differently. Some go with it. Some have no problem with it. Some, draw the line, and that line can be movable,
right,
according to different situations. But there are some artists who are really also politically, they won't play, they won't perform in a certain place because it's getting money from the state, for instance, or so it exists there. It has always existed, but this client, I don't know, what would you call it? So not client, this relationship where, you're being paid, you're in service, you're providing a service. So, and I understand it gets very fuzzy, so I think in design, or in, architecture design, in writing for, I guess, and it's always a thing, if you became really known for what you do, right, as a writer. And then they would say, okay, just, give us something, give me some more of that you do, and we'll produce it, because they, and in some cases they take a chance on you. I mean, even in the arts, they're taking a chance, so like they organize the concert, they make the record, and then it doesn't sell. So what I think there was more of, we shouldn't maybe be too naive about it, but I definitely think in earlier times, like in the 60s and 70s, that not everything was expected to sell. So like, I mean, most of the concerts downtown, in the downtown music scene, if you had 100 people, that was huge, and there was a lot of really interesting things where there would be maybe 10 people in the audience. I remember when I came to Europe, like some people say, they heard about the Knitting Factory in New York. It was legendary. And they traveled to New York and they were shocked to go into this like dirty little place. And they saw someone really famous and there were 5 people there, So, yeah, I mean, that's an issue in itself. But I think, so it exists in the arts, but yeah, more or less, there were some artists. I mean, I say artists in general in all fields where you can feel it that they're really doing what is wanted of them. Yeah. And even artists who start out sometimes very experimental and, somehow freer, then you can see gradually they're coming into producing what is expected of them, or which makes some money. I mean, it's something that everyone decides for themselves, like Phil Glass. I prefer the early work, but I understood that from friends of mine who performed his early work, he couldn't understand why they found that more interesting than what he was doing later. But yeah, the screenwriting, that must be really hard.
It is.
Yeah.
Were your parents political people?
Well, I mean, there was in my family, there were people that were blacklisted in the 50s. There were communists. It was kind of it came from, a bit leftist oriented Jewish family. There were those who were more political than others, but it was definitely, there were some very political people. Actually, the summer camp that I went to was kind of a Jewish communist summer camp. Mm-hmm. And so there was that, how political. I remember that though, when I went out, I mean, I was very young when I was protesting the Vietnam War and going to Washington, then my parents were really nervous. And they started to say, yeah, you don't know what happened in the 50s when people, were really couldn't work at all and things like that. So they remembered that atmosphere and they were scared that was going to happen again.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that any of them were revolutionaries,
Yeah.
I did also, I had a period, I met some guys, some people in the East Village. They took me to SDS meetings at Columbia. I started going to demonstrations. There was always kind of like the more political side of the 60s, and then there was the more hippie side.
Right.
And I mean, it's cliches, but, I was a bit more interested in the hippie side. I started out a little bit in the political thing, but it was the times, I was at this summer camp, in the summer camp, I was introduced. I don't know how old I was, probably 12 or something. I was introduced because a lot of the counselors there were from the East Village, and I was introduced to the Fugs.
Oh, yes.
I remember having in my hand the first Fugs record, very, very young, and reading the liner notes by Allen Ginsberg. And it was like, wow, what the hell is this? And Dylan, the early Dylan records. And so because, I was influenced by who was there. I mean, but there was always kind of those who were more into the, political action and those who were, interested in new ways of living and communes and all of that, So, yeah, there was the Whole Earth catalog and all that, there was some very interesting things. Yeah.
Was the household religious when you're growing up, or was it pretty secular?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I grew up actually in a Reform synagogue. So, but my grandfather who lived with us went to the Orthodox synagogue on the corner. but that's because he couldn't walk far enough to get to the conservative synagogue. So, yeah, we had all the holidays. I went to Hebrew school. I actually was banned from Hebrew school, or not Hebrew school. That was kind of very, maybe this shouldn't be. I don't know if all this should be in there, but I normally like to talk about this publicly, but there was, are you Jewish?
Yes.
Okay. So there was a Sunday school teacher who was talking about in very simplistic ways that how, Jews didn't worship idols so that they had immorality. And then I brought in the Hippocratic Oath to disprove it. And they didn't like that.
Oh, I got kicked out of religious school weekly for making jokes. And the rabbi would be like, can you just settle down? We're trying to learn about Job or whatever. And I would just keep making jokes. And he'd be like, okay, you're going to go sit over there and write an essay on whatever the closest Jewish holiday was. And that was, when I was a teenager, that was happening all the time. My dad was not happy with me.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't, okay. And of course a lot was happening. It was hard to, in my childhood, like going into, but even like when I was down in the East Village, I met some weird, there was a huge part of the scene that was Jewish. And so, I met some Kabbalists and interesting people. I feel like, and, friends of mine were all going into ashrams. I went to lectures of Tibetans, but I also always kind of like went to, if I would, I would look at lectures by, Tibetan lamas, and then I would go to hear a rabbi, like a mystical rabbi talk. So, I never left it completely. And hanging around the Lower East Side, which was a Jewish neighborhood, this is also crazy that at that time I remember finding out that actually my Aunt Belle was still living in the Lower East Side when I was hanging around this whole scene. I don't remember her. But yeah, that's a whole other issue. And if you talk about what's going on now, Europe is as complicated.
Yeah. We're right at the end, and I just have one kind of final question. Did your parents have any expectations for what they wanted from you?
Oh, boy. Yeah, of course. All parents have expectations, or most, certainly Jewish parents.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's very complicated in my case because my mother, I mean, they were into the arts, but when I went myself in as a, career, but what could you call it then? My mother, at some point, I think she was worried it was going to be too hard. And she felt that, I think she was very afraid of it, what it was going to happen, as if she passed on something to me that was going to make my life much harder. And in my case, my father was always a bit more proud of what I was doing. She was more scared, but so he took more pleasure in hearing about it. But it was really much later, like they wanted me to come back from Europe. I had nothing really in their eyes to show for it. I didn't have, I had no family. I mean, not in that sense. I had, in the way that you see some success developing, but then late in life or late in their lives, they did start to understand, okay, my mother died maybe before she could come here. She didn't make it here, but my father came and he saw what I was doing, and he didn't live to see me be a professor. But I think, he kind of got the feeling, okay, he understood, at some point at the end, but that took a lifetime.
Even before the accolades started to roll in, could they see that it was making you happy or that it was meaningful to you?
Well, I think they saw that it was meaningful to me. Actually, I have some funny stories there. There was a point when I was studying with Lamont Young. I mean, I had my first degree was in kind of video arts. They didn't know what to even tell the relatives. They said he's going to be a TV repairman. And little did they know I was taking apart TVs and destroying them. And then Lamont Young, that was even more weird. Yeah. Yeah, they had a hard time with that. It was very hard to understand this kind of people that I was hanging around with. So at some point, I remember I was still in New York. They asked this aunt of mine who is still alive and I'm still in touch with, who was in the dance world. and they asked her to meet me to find out what the hell this was, So I met her. She took me out to eat, to lunch at the Russian Tea Room, And I told her, I was interested in this composer. She knew who Lamont Young was.
Okay.
She didn't know much about that kind of music, but, she knew who John Cage was. She was in that world. And she told my parents, yeah, he's studying with an artist who's, very famous, and let's see where it goes, So I think that calmed them down a little bit for a while, even though they didn't really understand.
Okay. That feels, I was a philosophy professor before I did this, and they didn't understand that, and they don't understand what I do now. So
even a philosophy professor, a professor is the part that they understand, but they just didn't understand the philosophy. Right. It didn't make a difference.
Right. No. Yeah. Yeah. So this feels very familiar. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for taking the time. I know that.
Yeah. If you do think of coming or visiting, let me know.
I will. Thank you.
Okay. Good luck.
Have a good night.
Okay. Ciao.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.